Hello, and welcome to Give and Take. Here we look at science issues to equip you to spread the gospel. Today we want to look at a question that's often out there. If evolution is correct, does that mean the atheists are right and there is no God? Joined today by Fuzz and AJ, we're going to dig right in. So Fuzz and AJ, how would you respond to that question? If evolution is correct, does that mean atheism's right and God just isn't there?
I don't think so. I think that the atheist is still left with something to ground the beginning and all of the processes that they observe in nature and in the universe around them.
Okay, so
They're still left with that problem, even if evolution is completely true.
Okay, well, let me ask a kind of a different question there. Let's go a little bit different for a little while. What is evolution? And so what are we talking about when we say evolution?
I think it's basically change. And evolution in science can mean change on many different levels. It can mean it on a micro level, or it can mean it on a macro level.
Okay.
Micro level would be like in a cell or in a single cell organism or even in a multicellular organism. But on a macro level, that would be those larger changes from species to a totally different kind of species.
So the micro would be the bacteria developing resistance to an antibiotic, whereas the macro would be an elephant becoming a giraffe.
Exactly,
Okay.
or something like that.
Well, maybe not quite so big. And I know I think you've actually delineated even some more different divisions of evolution.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to just flesh those, or to briefly say what they are, because we're going to come back and hit those.
Sure. Fuzz and I have talked
minutes.
about this a lot, but we basically break it down into 5 categories. Chemical evolution, which would be origin of life from
So this
inorganic.
is how do you get the original chemicals to form something that's self-replicating, whatever life is?
Self-replicating and alive, yes,
Okay.
basically. And then there would be microevolution.
Okay.
And then microevolution is basically mutations that are selected for by some type of selection process that give benefit or fitness advantages to the organism that has that mutation.
So this is the bacteria developing
So if you actually
like
take it
that.
into an organism, like a single cell organism, like a bacteria, that would be microbial evolution, and that would be
Okay.
one example of microevolutionary
Okay.
processes.
What's the next level?
The next level would be speciation, which is the ability of a species or a kind, like human beings, to adapt to different types of environments or environmental stresses. And for
Okay.
those adaptations to actually push in a particular direction that might even actually lead to something that looks like an isolated group of a reproducing population, right?
And I gather there's a little bit of difficulty discerning species at some level in that
There's
correct?
not just a little bit of
Okay,
difficulty.
that's
That's a very fuzzy boundary.
All right, great.
Right?
That's good to know. So what's next?
And then the 5th one would be macroevolution, which is basically that type of speciation adaptability that is built into our genomes and can lead to these types of different populations becoming isolated, that over long periods of time, that actually accounts for the different phyla that we see, large groups of very different kinds of animals.
Okay, so this is change on the big scale. I mean, some of it's changed to a very small scale up to a very large scale.
That's right.
Is what it amounts
That's
to.
right.
Okay, so let me ask kind of the question that I think most everybody wants to know. Does the scientific data force us to accept these kinds of evolution?
Well,
Fuzz,
I don't
let's
think
throw
so,
it to
yeah.
you.
Well, I mean, I would say the answer is no. Clearly, evolutionary biologists would argue that there's compelling evidence for an evolutionary history to life on Earth.
And so this is the macroevolution, everything encompassed in there.
Exactly. And they would point to things like shared biological features among organisms, with the argument being that those shared features must be found in the ancestral organism that gave rise to the different lineages. Or they might point to the fossil record and say, look, we see a history of life on Earth where there's different life forms at different times, so hence life evolved. But there are plenty of reasons to think that this evolutionary mechanism, in a broad sense, is insufficient to account for the origin, the history, and the design of life.
Well, so what are kind of 2 or 3 of your best examples?
Well, for example, I would point to the origin of life question.
That's right.
Okay, so this is the original chemical evolution.
That's exactly right. Even people that are atheists, that are deeply committed to the evolutionary paradigm, that are actively working on that problem, will readily admit we have no explanation for how life originates. Or you look at an event like the Cambrian explosion, which is the first appearance of complex animals on the surface of the Earth.
So this would be kind of up at that species level, or even beyond the phyla level.
At the
Okay.
phylum
All right,
level.
so this is a big deal.
Right. There's just not an explanation for why suddenly, virtually out of nowhere in a geological instant, we see this explosive appearance of all these different animal phyla. So
okay.
these are 2 places where the paradigm at this point in time has no explanation for these events in life's history.
So with this is a place where there's not an adequate explanation. So are you saying, well, okay, obviously God did it here, or what are you saying?
No, I would say that it means that it's unsustainable to say that life's origin, history, and design can be completely accounted for through evolutionary mechanisms, because these are places where it's clear at this point in time that that's not the case.
Okay, so stated another way, it's not that we can necessarily say where God intervened or not, but to claim that evolution accounts for everything and therefore God doesn't exist is inadequate, because there are these clear places where the mechanism is insufficient at this point.
Yes.
Not even weighing in on what might we find in the future.
That's
correct?
exactly
okay.
right. Yes.
So let me throw a different question out there. We've talked a little bit about what evolution is, what it can't, or some of the problems with it.
I actually like to add something to what
Please,
evolution is, because you guys have already touched on it in Fuzz's question and response, but evolution can also mean that overarching paradigm, which is really a commitment to naturalistic explanations for the origin and the history and the diversity of life on Earth. So we also have to think about that sixth category, which is sort of overarching all of the other categories, and it's really a philosophical paradigm.
Yeah. So if I were to characterize it then, or what that sounds like to me, is that there's two things. One is there may be process and mechanism that might explain some of this, but there's another level of evolution which says we can explain this all apart from God, effectively, is what that means.
Yes.
Is that a legitimate, or say we find something that explains all the mechanism, does that mean that God isn't there?
I certainly don't think so. Again, I think if you want to appeal only to the evolutionary mechanism, and you want to remain sort of agnostic as to what science will be able to describe in the future, and even be very optimistic and say someday science can explain it all, it can't ever explain it all. It can't explain sort of the nature of nature, or the fact that nature is the way that it is, and why there is something rather than nothing.
So why are we here? Why does it exist the way it does?
Why does it make sense?
Yeah,
why can rational creatures make sense out of it and do experiments on it and actually gain knowledge from it? I mean, all of that needs an explanation too that is outside of the capacity of a naturalistic explanation.
So Fuzz, I mean, so how would you, are you comfortable with the idea that process can explain everything? Do you think we're going to find the origin of life and the Cambrian explosion? And if we do, what would you wrestle with that?
Well, I mean, I think AJ makes a good point that God could create exclusively through process. Mm-hmm. But as somebody who's a creationist, I argue that God creates not only through process, but also through intervening in a direct personal way. And I actually think that the origin of life is one of those places where God has intervened in a direct personal way to bring about his creative purposes. I think when it comes to the origin of humanity, that's another place where, to me, it seems like there is some kind of intervention that must have taken place, particularly when you talk about the fact that human beings seem to be exceptional. We stand apart from all other creature. There's this quality that we would call the image of God as Christians that seems to set human beings apart from all their creature, and there's just not an evolutionary mechanism for where that exceptional nature to humanity comes from.
From an evangelistic standpoint, how do you see this play out in discussions? Is the God used all process or God intervening? I mean, what have you seen work and not work there?
Well, in my experience, if somebody is deeply committed to the evolutionary paradigm, to say to them that maybe God used process exclusively to bring about his creative purposes, to those kind of people, it just sounds like religious talk. They're not really impacted by that.
It doesn't compel them to think or wrestle with issues.
It doesn't. And so what I find is you've got to be disruptive to their paradigm. You've got to go in there and show, look, the origin of life at this point doesn't have an explanation, or the Cambrian explosion doesn't have an explanation, to force them to begin to think that maybe their worldview may be lacking and that there may be something to the Christian perspective.
So, last question here, briefly answered, 10 seconds or less. What do you find the most disruptive piece of scientific evidence?
To me, it's the origin of life.
Origin of life?
I would have to agree, the origin of life.
The origin of life.
Yeah.
So as we've wrestled here, the idea that evolution explains everything, really there are problems with that. There are origin of life issues. There's the Cambrian explosion that certainly prevent us from saying that evolution accounts for everything. But even if there is process that God uses, which I think we find in the Genesis account, there's still lots of evidence that point to God's creative work in preparing us. And that is one of the things we can use to go out and disrupt the naturalist worldview and help them consider the claims of the gospel and spread the message of Jesus to them.